So good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Bermuda Chamber of Commerce hosted Pathways to Status panel discussion. My name is John White, and I'm the president of the Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to first establish protocol by recognizing the following individuals in our audience. Minister of Home Affairs, the Honorable Patricia J. Gordon-Pamplin, JP, MP. Deputy Opposition Leader and Shadow Minister of Finance, Mr. David Burt, JP, MP. Shadow Minister of Home Affairs, Mr. Walter H. Robban, JP, MP. Senator Kim Wilkerson. Walton Brown, JP, MP, and U.S. Consul General, Mrs. Mary Ellen Koenig. So we have three very well-respected and well-known panelists sitting next to me this morning to discuss a topic that we all know is very important to Bermuda. It's very emotional. We remember that week back in March that was not very pleasant for anybody on the island. And so at the Chamber of Commerce, we have felt that it's important for our group to put together forums to discuss topics that are relevant to Bermuda. So the objective of the Chamber this morning is not to impart our opinions or views on what immigration policy reform should look like. It's our objective at this point to just create this forum to have three very well-respected and well-known panelists give their views on immigration policy and reform to enable all of you in the audience to perhaps learn something new to assist you in forming your own opinions of immigration reform and policy. I'll introduce our first panelist. The bios are pretty extensive, so in the interest of time, I've sort of cut them down to about half of what I could say about all of them because they all have very extensive credentials. But Lynn Winfield is head of administration and company secretary for an international telecommunications company and is responsible for corporate governance, compliance, and risk management in Bermuda, Japan, Guam, and Australia. She is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and an accredited director. She has a BA in psychology from Queen's University and her graduate certification in social justice, diversity, and inclusion from the University of Colorado. Currently, she is working on her Master of Science in Social Justice and Community Action with the University of Edinburgh. She is a trained mediator using the social justice mediation model, has trained in cross-cultural facilitation, and is a licensed trainer with the International Institute for Restorative Practices. Many of you would know her perhaps for her association with Citizens Uprooting Racism in Bermuda. So with that introduction, over to Lynn.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everybody. This presentation has been compiled from a 2-hour presentation, so I've really pushed it together rapidly, so you'll have to excuse me. I'm going to read fairly quickly because I'm skimming on the 15-minute mark here, so thank you for your attention. History is integral to our present. It provides us with identity and offers us narrative to explain our place in the world. However, history told only from a dominant perspective creates dysfunction and imbalance and contributes to ongoing legacies of injustice, inequity, and continued conflict. Bermuda has historically been a country divided by racial conflict and oppression. 211 years of slavery codified in law, 137 years of segregation codified in culture. This presentation will show how constant efforts over the centuries to retain power and control and racial demographics in Bermuda was successful. Without that purposeful manipulation, the population today would more likely reflect that of the Caribbean islands, i.e. the less than 3% identifying as white. In 1623, Bermuda passed the very first act anywhere in the British colonies to control black people, entitled An Act to Restrain the Insolence of the Negroes. By 1626, the number of enslaved people was so great Chattel slavery was formally written into law. Acts were repeatedly passed to deport free blacks from the island. In 1761, a major slave rebellion involving over half the population was planned. They were betrayed, 6 enslaved people were hung, others sold overseas, and the Council and Assembly of the day enacted legislation to banish free Negroes and mulattoes from Bermuda. Those who did not leave were re-enslaved. Another act in 1806 stated, and I quote, "Whereas the black population of these islands has of late years increased in a manner very injurious to the welfare of this community, and whereas it is thought expedient to adopt all such proper and practicable measures as may be calculated to diminish the relative proportion of black to the white population." The violent threat of being sold or sent south to plantations was one method used to control enslaved Bermudians. Mary Prince is Bermuda's most famous example. With emancipation in 1834, the oligarchy by necessity focused its attention on the vote. Historian Kenneth Robinson states it was a cold-blooded, retrograde piece of legislation which raised the qualifications for electors and candidates for the first time in 55 years. And by the way, Mr. Joel was the first person to become an MP, black person to become an MP. It took 50 years before that was achieved. Control was exerted over the black population through the means of economic violence. If one stood up to the oligarchy, one risked not only one's own job, but those of the family, People were turned out of homes, land lost, and future work impossible to obtain. 1842 saw an act passed to encourage emigrants from England. Kenneth Robinson again wrote, it was the first post-abolition endeavor to increase instantly the relative size of the white population. 1847. The legislature voted £400 as bounties to vessels which brought immigrants from Madeira. That's the equivalent of $42,000 today. And by 1849, the first vessel arrived, bringing 58 Portuguese people. And for the next 100 plus years, Portuguese were restricted to only menial jobs. Not viewed as white, many settled in black communities, worked alongside blacks, intermarried, became friends, and sent their children to black schools, as like black Bermudians, they were not allowed to attend white schools. After emancipation, oppressive conditions were so severe that in the next 110 years, workers were able to mount only 3 major demonstrations against exploitation of their labor. And that was for the reason of economic violence that would occur if you stood up for your rights. The first, in 1853, saw black Bermudians protesting, this is sort of a déjà vu moment, against government's use of taxpayers' money to import Portuguese laborers to undercut wage rates. Black people, this is a direct quote again, black people condemned the proposal as the last extreme of oppression by a legislature composed of white employers to use taxes to which black people had contributed to import to Bermuda competition that was clearly calculated to injure black workers. 1894. West Indians began migrating to Bermuda in larger numbers, with a large influx in 1901 and 1906 brought in by the Admiralty to help with the ongoing construction of Dockyard. Viewed as troublemakers by the white oligarchy and fearful of the more radical ideas being brought to the island, black Bermudians were encouraged to see themselves as better than their West Indian cousins. Described by Ira Philippine's book, Freedom Fighters, as the divide and rule tactics that for generations confused and demoralized black Bermudians, segregated black and white Bermudians, and poisoned Bermudian-West Indian relations. 1920, the Development Company Act. A private bill enforced widespread purchase of approximately 510 acres of land in Tucker's Town, land owned predominantly by black Bermudians who had created a community and lived there for multiple generations since the early 1800s. They were dispossessed of their land by Bermudian legislatures in order to create the equivalent of a Palm Beach of Bermuda for wealthy Americans. Professor Duncan McDowell, in his published article, Trading Places, stated it required a majority of black Bermudians to surrender their lands to a private company dominated by wealthy whites. Their immediate gain was thus a private one, as the colony's commercial elite equated the project with its own economic agenda. Between 1900 and 1921, the population grew by just over 3,000 to just over 20,000 people. However, in just 10 years, the population exploded by over 7,600 to nearly 28,000 in 1931, the majority of whom were whites brought into work in the burgeoning tourism industry as Black Bermudians and Portuguese continued to be restricted to menial work. Worried about the growing and united Black and Portuguese working class and the fear of losing political control, the oligarchy began a process of empowering initially a select few of the Portuguese community, allowing access to loans, mortgages, and education at white private schools, and eventually access to white society, whilst continuing to deny the same to the Black community. The building of schools for the Portuguese in 1931 contributed to the widening divide. This purposeful separation, using the divide and rule tactics of the past, ensured a rift grew between the Portuguese and Black Bermudian communities, encouraged by the white oligarchy, thus ensuring that many Portuguese would vote white. In 1940, the UK passed a Colonial Development and Welfare Act, following a wave of strikes and unrest that swept the Caribbean in the mid-30s. The Act promised British territories extra funding for social and economic development. Despite tremendous pressure from the UK, the Bermuda government turned down the funding and refused to implement any of the social and labour reforms. In 1941, the American vice consul stated, "For 100 years, a small group has made Bermuda its own paradise by controlling legislation and policy kept all but themselves in strict economic subjection, whilst they themselves accumulated fortunes subject to no taxes whatsoever." June 1943 saw the commanding general of the US Army's Fort Bell being told by the Bermuda government that it would object strongly to the importation of non-white labour and would be obliged to withhold the issuance of landing permits to any non-white base workers. Immigration control was not only method used to control demographics. In the mid-1920s, the Bermuda government set up the Bermuda Welfare Society to keep tabs on the births of the Black population. Dr. Jolene Bean noted in her dissertation that unfortunately, population control was a reoccurring theme throughout Bermuda's history. Dr. Bean's research uncovered a 1935 government paper called the Report on Unemployment, which recommended laws be passed to compulsorily sterilize certain segments, Blacks and mentally challenged, of the population. While the recommendation was never carried out, it did cause a public outcry from both Blacks and whites. What prompted the document was the realization that the Black population far outnumbered the white population. In 1937, Margaret Sanger, a famous birth control advocate and proponent of sterilization and eugenics, was invited to Bermuda to confer with Bermuda's leaders about birth control. 3 meetings took place at the House of Assembly, a very strange place to talk about birth control. With members of the House, Legislative Council, and Board of Health. Her report noted that the birth rate among the coloured people was almost double that of the whites, and that 2 clinics were to be opened, one for coloured people and one for whites. We haven't yet found the research that will find out what actually happened. 1957, we're getting close. The Bermuda government began a family planning program, which resulted in only 1,000 babies being born in 1966, compared to an average of 1,141 births per year over the previous decade. Today, it is argued, and we have heard anecdotal evidence, that these programs were focused primarily at Black Bermudian families and included coerced hysterectomies and sterilization. 1954 saw the introduction of the term Bermuda status. Interestingly, my children's great-grandparents came in under that 1954 piece of legislation. And prior to that, under the 1936 Immigration Act, there was a concept of deemed domicile. The 1956 Immigration and Protection Act then came into place, written during the segregation era. It has had over 55 amendments since then. We think of the 1959 theatre boycott as the beginning of desegregation, but it wasn't until 1971, 12 years later, that the last piece of legislation was passed to desegregate the primary schools, not so long ago. The 1960s to 1990s saw a continuation of the racialized immigration policies. A comparison of the 1950, 1960, and 1970 censuses reveal a remarkable increase in the number of non-Bermudians. In 1950, a total of 7,387 were foreign-born, which grew modestly by 1960 to 8,753. The following decade saw a significant escalation in the foreign-born population, an increase of some 66% to a total of 14,496 persons. 1960 saw the formation and tireless efforts of the Committee for Universal Adult Suffrage, led by Roosevelt Brown, later known as Paulo Camargo, finally resulting in universal adult suffrage with the introduction of the 1963 Parliamentary Election Act. But the oligarchy continued to exert their control of the vote by ensuring the act included extra plus votes for property owners. Historically, that meant whites. All British subjects living on the island for a period of at least 3 years were given the vote. That vote stayed in place for the rest of their lives, even though that piece of legislation was taken away in 1979. 83% of those individuals were white. The voting age was raised from 21 to 25, the only country in the world that raised the voting age rather than lower it to 18 at that time. 1,900 young people were disenfranchised as a result of that change. 1967. During a debate in the UK Parliament on the introduction of Bermuda's first constitution, the Hansard reports a discussion on Bermuda status, with a speaker in the House noting that out of 706 applications, only 4 were given to blacks, 2 of which later went on to run for the United Bermuda Party. Over the last 30 years, over 50% of those granted Bermudian status have been white, whereas the voting population is only 25% white. The Wooding Commission, following the 1968 youth riots, stated that the roots of the civil disorders lie deep in the history of Bermuda society. The society was typically white plantation in character, and the history in the years before the 40s was of accepted white supremacy with all the concomitant evils of segregation. The Commission found that virtually everything in Bermudian society was viewed in racial terms, describing as defining all facets of society, relationships between the police and blacks, the banning of black publications, the disputes between political parties, and the attitudes of all Bermudians. The Pitt Commission, following the 1977 riots, stated the importance of substantially reducing immigration and assisting the promotion of Bermudians. This recommendation was in direct response to the rapidly increasing expatriate population and an acknowledgement of the detrimental effects it was having on the African Bermudian population. 1985, the Archibald Royal Commission on Drugs and Alcohol stated institutionalized racism was so bad that it occurred throughout Bermuda society, in government, business, banks, churches, schools, unions, political parties, clubs, and courts, and generally seemed to be committed in the name of preserving business traditions and maintaining standards, a fact that made it no less destructive to human life and self-esteem. 1989 Amendment to the Act. No more discretionary grants of Bermuda status after 1st of July 1989. Up to that point, 40 per annum were granted. This was due to concerns raised by the opposition that political favoritism was involved in a number of awards with far more whites than blacks receiving status. 1994 Amendment allowed those who have close ties to Bermudian families to attain status. 2001 Amendment recognized that the Act caused some hardship to certain long-term residents and provided permanent resident certificates to those who had been on the island since 1st of July 1989. And this provided safety of tenure and all rights with the exception of the vote. And also term limit policies were enacted to better control the creation of long-term residents, which had been a policy of the previous racialized immigration policies. 2009 Mincy Report states that race does account for 29% of the racial gap in predicted earnings between young black and white Bermudian males. He noted that young Bermudian men have similar employment, enrollment, and labor force participation rates. However, the big difference is unemployment. The proportion of young black Bermudian men at that time who were looking unsuccessfully for work in 2010 was 14%, while the proportion of white Bermudian men was 8%. It is important to note that only 30 out of almost 200 countries grant citizenship at birth. The International Monetary Fund advised that among advanced economies, only Canada and the United States observe unconditional birthright of citizens, a legacy of their history to encourage immigration after the annihilation of their indigenous populations. Almost all states in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania grant citizenship based on the right of blood, a principle of nationality law in which citizenship is inherited through parents rather than by birthplace. United Nations General Assembly resolutions represent the highest principles and standards agreed by the global community. With regard to small territories, UN resolutions specifically state, 1, that member states adopt necessary measures to prevent the systemic influx of foreign immigrants, which disrupts the integrity and social, political, and cultural unity of the peoples under colonial rule. 2, disrupts the demographic composition of those territories, which may constitute a major obstacle to the genuine exercise of the right to self-determination and independence by the people of those territories. And 3, as a matter of major priority, administrating powers ensure that the exercise of self-determination is not affected by changes in the demographic composition due to immigration or displacement of populations in the territories. The legacy of this past includes continued economic disparity for Black Bermudians, higher rates of incarceration and stop and search, education inequities, higher rates of poverty, redundancy, employment, underemployment, and lower incomes. Desegregation didn't see racism, prejudice, and stereotypes against Black Bermudians disappear overnight. Ongoing structural racism and implicit bias continue to impact opportunities for Black Bermudians today. This has been severely worsened by the economic downturn, resulting in the forced migration of thousands of educated Black Bermudians reluctantly leaving Bermuda in order to support their families. Numbers have been estimated between 3,000 and 6,000, and it is notable that there is no mechanism in place to monitor this exodus. In 1994, sociologists... Yes, last page.
Last page, okay. Good, thank you.
Don't worry, that's the bibliography. So, in 1994, sociologist Dorothy Newman, in her book, Bermuda's Stride Towards the 21st Century, noted, "It is, for instance, essential in a biracial society for data to be collected, analyzed, and published by race. The fact that this is not the case in some Bermuda institutions is, in itself, institutional racism. This type of brain drain predominantly occurs in developing countries. It is noteworthy that in Bermuda's highly developed economy, educated Black Bermudians feel forced to look overseas for opportunities. This brain drain must be reversed and Bermudians encouraged to return. Creative plans for the provision of job opportunities, introduction of robust legislation to protect Black Bermudian work opportunities, an urgent focus on integrating young Bermudians into the workforce, introduction of a living wage, and protection for Bermudians who are increasingly being hired for part-time or temporary work, with employers sidestepping the need to provide benefits, must all be put in place. The 2010 census showed that 8 out of 10 Black Bermudians were born in Bermuda, but only 4 out of 10 white Bermudians were born in Bermuda, a direct result of the racialized immigration policies of the past. Polls have repeatedly shown that over 90% of white voters vote for one party. The people protesting the proposed legislation on the Hill understood the very real risk of disenfranchisement. CURB's research on immigration and demographics has shown that this fear has a very real and frightening foundation based on historical oppression and current economic marginalization. We hope that by sharing this information, sensitivity to the issues will be raised. With sensitivity comes empathy, which in turn allows relationships to form. With relationships, we can begin the difficult work of consultation and collaboration to create a more equitable Bermuda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Our next presenter will be Craig Simmons, and Craig's bio is, Craig is a senior lecturer in economics at Bermuda College His teaching experience at Bermuda College includes courses in microeconomics, macroeconomics, international economics, and ecological economics. Craig was a member of the inaugural Sustainable Development Roundtable created by Cabinet in the spring of 2005, the Energy Commission, a regulatory body, in 2012, and the Spending and Government Efficiency, or better known as SAGE Commission, set up by the Minister of Finance in April 2013. More recently, in November 2015, his opinion was sought by the Fiscal Responsibility Panel as a part of its annual assessment of Bermuda's medium-term fiscal strategy. So without further ado, over to Craig.
Thank you. I want to use a sort of a traditional growth model that macroeconomists use to explain growth. It's the SOLO growth model, S-O-L-O-W. Those of you who have done intermediate macro should be familiar with that. And so these models are rather simple, but they're good in the sense that they're pretty good at predicting or explaining growth over decades. So if you want to understand why the US economy or why European economies have grown systemically over many, many decades, so the SOLO growth model, in fact, is a good way of explaining it. It doesn't necessarily explain everything, but it's a pretty simple thing, and models are often judged by their explanatory power and also the fact that they're pretty straightforward to use. So the SOLO model, it assumes two factors of production: physical capital, that is things like this, hotels, buildings, machines, plant equipment, and labor. And it essentially says that the more labor and the more capital you have, the faster economies will grow. That's the number one takeaway from the SOLO model. Problems with the model, at least if you bring it home to Bermuda, is that it ignores what I call social and market risk. Some of the social risks, you would have difficulty explaining why, for example, since 2000, when we saw the fastest economic growth in Bermuda, between say 2000 and 2007, how do you explain that the number of Bermudians in the labor force decreased in every single year since 2000? In fact, the number of Bermudians in the labor force has continued to decrease. So ordinarily, we would like to think that Bermudian participation in the labor force would improve during growth spurts, but the most recent one, the best that we've ever had, that didn't happen. And so we infer from that that the Bermudian labor force has in fact shrunk during that period. I think Lynn alluded to that. Which brings up the third problem with the SOLO model, as it's traditionally enunciated, that it makes no distinction in terms of labor between, say, skilled or unskilled labor, or if you want to bring it home to Bermuda, between foreign and local labor. Sustained economic growth can only be explained in the SOLO model by what they call labor augmenting technical change, which is a simple way of saying that technology is what grows economies. But it will only grow the economy if that technology trickles down or makes its way into the minds of workers, principally skilled workers. And so that's really the only way we can explain sustained economic growth in, say, a US economy or British economy, is that workers have in fact gained from the technological progress that has occurred in those economies. So it's not necessarily the number of workers that's important, it's the productivity of workers that's important. That's something seems to be missing in this debate. The Bermudian economy is really based on what I call a complementarity between foreign and local labor, to the extent that if you bring someone in, an actuary or an underwriter, a financial analyst, that's going to create local employment. And I think that has been the underlying assumption of economic growth in Bermuda. That if you build an international business sector, that it will grow the economy indirectly. You bring in these experts, and these experts will need supports, whether it be clerical or middle management, and Bermudians can assume those particular jobs. be well paid, buy houses, and so on. But what we've seen since 2000 is that despite the fastest growth that the economy has ever experienced, that the number of Bermudians didn't in fact increase. So that suggests that the complementarity principle that underlies our economic model is breaking down, or at least it warrants some kind of investigation, which to my mind has not been undertaken. In fact, the complementarity, or the breaking down of the complementarity between foreign and local labor has created a tension point, which is, I suppose, what was happening up on the Hill a couple of weeks ago, where Bermudians feel as if this economy, or they have no place in this economy. And so if you feel you don't have any place in an economy, you tend to, well, not care, and you want change. It's only natural. Institutions. It's clear that institutions matter. I infer from that in fact inclusive institutions are in fact good for growth. Put another way, inclusiveness is in fact a growth strategy. And we need to work on that because it's not clear that we are as inclusive as we would like to be. Whilst labor markets are reasonably inclusive, there are other parts of our economy that perhaps need as much attention, if not more attention, than the issues of immigration. I'll talk about three of them. First would be the performance of telecoms in Bermuda. I suppose most of you use the internet. I try not to. But the cost of a megabit per second in Bermuda is light years ahead of the cost in any other jurisdiction. Based on data collected in February, it costs in excess of $9.50 for a megabit per second of data in Bermuda. When you compare that with other jurisdictions, other island jurisdictions, countries like Jamaica, St. Kitts, the costs are in the region of $1 and $2 per megabit per second. Yeah. So I've had conversations with folks in the industry and they say, well, it's a question of scale. Well, a country like St. Kitts is as small as Bermuda, but yet you can buy a megabit of internet data in St. Kitts for like $4. Speeds in other jurisdictions are rather high. To my way of thinking in terms of economic growth, arguably that is a major barrier to growth. Similarly, in respect to financial inclusion, the unbanked in our community are, well, they're having a hard time securing loans. Small businesses having a hard time securing loans. These are also things that are inhibiting growth. And the final thing is in respect to electricity. Another institutional barrier that needs to be dealt with in terms of growth, moving away from non-renewable energy toward renewable energy. So we seem to be focused almost exclusively on this one institutional barrier called immigration, when in fact there are several others that arguably are bigger barriers to growth. With that, I think I'll wait for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you, Craig. So batting cleanup today, we have Phil Butterfield. So Phil served as chairman of HSBC Bank Bermuda from May 2012 to December of 2015. Prior to this, he held the position of Chief Executive Officer of the bank from February 2004 until May 2012. He was Chief Operating Officer of the Bank of Bermuda from 2002 to 2004 with responsibility for global operations systems, human resources, audit, compliance, and legal affairs. He joined the Bank of Bermuda in 2000 as Chief Administration Officer. Before joining the Bank of Bermuda, Phil held a number of senior positions with Citibank, which he joined in 1972, entering their management training program. His experience there included private banking, corporate banking, operations, and technology, and human resources. So that background, Phil, over to you.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. In the spirit of understanding that I am at a stage in life where I've had more yesterdays than I will have tomorrows, I want to make 6 quick points. 3 with regard to context for this question of pathway to status, and 3 points with regard to how I see the way forward on this issue. First point, I believe that immigration, race, and politics are inextricably linked here in Bermuda. And this is as a result of our past history, which Lynn shared with you this morning. Any effort that we make to separate or segment these 3 elements will, in my judgment, produce a suboptimal solution that will only further divide us as a community. Therefore, the work that needs to be done needs to address these 3 issues concurrently. Number 2, this question of pathways to status is perhaps one of the most critical issues of our time. And in my judgment, the reason it is so critical is that it speaks to the determination of who it is that we want to be as a community. And that is a serious question and a challenging one to resolve. Point 3, our economic success is dependent upon adding new people with skills, knowledge, and experience that will contribute to a sustainable level of success. Immigration is a necessity. Bermudians cannot and do not fill all of the jobs that exist within our economy. As Craig mentioned, in the 2007-2008 period prior to the recession, I believe there were approximately 38,000 jobs in the country, 28,000 able-bodied Bermudians. You do the math. We needed 10,000 guest workers. If we are to either replicate and or improve upon our past success, then in my view, our focus must be to identify the best 10,000 people we can find to achieve that success. However, at the same time, we need to accelerate the training and development of Bermudian workers so that they are fit for 21st century work. It is my strongly held view that a root cause for the challenges that we face today is that there is an insufficient number of Bermudians, particularly black Bermudians, who participate equitably in our economy. And now with regard to the way forward, again, 3 points in the spirit of being focused and fast. Number 1, I believe that we must have a fact-based discussion and debate. We cannot determine where it is we want to be without understanding where we are and using that knowledge to develop the plan of how we want to get to the solution we desire. It is my view that we need to know the demographics of the community of persons who have been granted status in the past. Go back 50 years, we should understand race, gender, place of origin, skill sets for the population of persons who came to Bermuda. Also, we should understand the economic contribution that they made. All of these potentially could be criteria for selection going forward. Second, I believe it is imperative that the government and the opposition tell us what they expect our community to look like over the next 3, 5, 15, 20 years, directly as a result of their proposed policies. This transparency is a necessary requirement to address the historical mistrust and to remedy the biased behavior of the past. And by the way, to be quite clear, I view yesterday as the past. Number 3, the decision process must be based in equity, not equality. And here's the difference. If I walk into a room of 20 people and I have $100 in my pocket and choose to give everybody $5, I've acted equally. If, however, I decide to do some work and engage those 20 people in a discussion and gather some facts, there may be some people who will get $1 and a person or two who might get 10. Equity requires a level of engagement and a level of work that has to be done by persons who possess the qualities of high intelligence, integrity, independence, and persons whose decision-making capacities are respected by a substantial majority of our countrymen. This is the only way I believe we can instill confidence and respect for the work and the result that we desire. If we ignore these prerequisites, not only will we further alienate major segments of our community, but we will, in all likelihood, increase the likelihood of social chaos. An equitable solution will improve the level of economic participation by all Bermudians in our economy going forward. So take on the task of dealing with the issue of equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Very good. So hopefully you enjoyed, as I did, each of our panelists' views on immigration. And that has brought forward some very interesting questions from the audience that I will read out and try to allocate. These are some tough questions. Let me start with the easier ones. Well, I'm not sure there's an easy one. Lynn, how can Bermuda best resolve the lack of trust between labor and management without acrimony?
Okay. A lot of people have said to me, how do we fix it? And if I knew the answer to that, I think Curb would be multimillionaires and it's not been fixed. So how do we move forward as a society? Bermuda is unique. We parallel many things that have happened in the United States, but our past is unique, and as such, we have to address that past. Now, with regard to labor and management, the most key aspect is collaboration and consultation. There has to be that. There's too many misunderstandings, too many past issues that have not been addressed, and that past is so present currently today in Bermuda that unless you're willing to sit down and have some hard discussions, and we all don't really like hard discussions, but we all have the best interest of Bermuda in our hearts, I hope. And unless we're willing to sit down and collaborate and consult and share the realities of both sides, both labor and management, and what it's like from those both sides, we're not going to move forward. So it has to be that process. There is no other way in a country that has been conflicted for so long. And I would want to point out that Professor Brendan O'Leary, who recently visited Bermuda, said that there were three main sources of conflict that a country has to meet before they need to move forward and find some way. And two of those issues, sources, Bermuda has. One of them is exclusion. We have a long and extended history of exclusion, and as Phil pointed out, he considers it up until yesterday. The second one that Bermuda meets out of the three is the fact that what they refer to the dominant group's failure or inability to address those imbalances. So we have to look that we as a country are still in conflict. As much as we walk around and feel that we're all friendly and we have this beautiful country that we live in, there is conflict, unresolved conflict, and as any businessman knows, you have to resolve those issues. And so as a consequence, I would say labor and management, you have got to be willing to sit down and really talk the hard talk to find some way forward that is equitable for everybody.
Good, thank you, Lynn.
Okay.
They say as we use our computers more and more that our handwriting gets worse and worse over time. And I'm trying to read some of these questions. If I don't quite get some of the wording correct, please bear with me. This one is actually attributed to, or asked of Craig. So Craig, if overall growth of Bermudians in the workforce did not happen between 2000 and 2007, were there any specific sectors where there was dramatic growth over particular sectors where there was decline?
Yeah, I think economies are complex. It's sometimes nonsensical to use averages. So generally, I think sectors in which there was a high degree of what we call human capital formation, technical and skilled areas, those areas would have seen growth, and the unskilled areas would have seen decline. You see this mirrored in the US, where the economy may be growing, unemployment may be down, but if you don't have skills and you're coming out of the manufacturing sector, you're not going to see much improvement in your salary or job opportunities. But if you're in IT, the phone's ringing off the hook. So I would say that in Bermuda, whilst we haven't looked at the data in any detail, that's my sense, that if you are in a skilled area, you're doing okay, and the demand for those skills are going up, which goes back to something that Lynn mentioned, remedying that the problem of the 21st century, as far as I'm concerned, is how do you eliminate the skills deficit among locals? And of course that starts with things like education, apprenticeships, that kind of thing. How do you increase the skills deficit? How do you diminish it? As an economist, you would suggest, well, create a market for it, which I suppose says that public education is not doing a very good job of it. And so you allow the market to do its thing and just support people who are very good at diminishing the skills deficit.
Good. Thank you. Phil, I don't want to leave you out. Can an immigration policy based on correcting past ills or perceptions of racism assist the economic development of a jurisdiction which relies on outside capital and, to a large extent, expertise? If so, how?
A very intriguing question. I'd say we need to do several things concurrently. There is no single, silver bullet solution here. We have to have immigration because we have a skills deficit for the types of jobs that exist within our economy. So we have to continue to attract the people necessary to fill those jobs. At the same time, we need to do a better job of training and developing Bermudians for the work that exists within our economy. And I think that that's the area where we have failed. So my view is take on those two tasks concurrently and do so with a great deal of emphasis on the training and development of Bermudians. And over time, I think you can begin to see a shift in the prospects that those persons have for success.
Thank you. Lynn, this question is, what is a Bermudian? And it says, could we get a definition from each of the panelists? It says including the moderator, but the moderator is not going to opine on this one this morning. But I will ask if each of the panelists would like to respond to this one.
Okay, what is a Bermudian? A lot of different theories out there. United Nations has a very good understanding of it. We often talk about there's no such thing as a Bermudian except for the skinks that were on the island. But the UN does clearly state that it refers to peoples who've been in a country for an extended period of time. The New Zealanders, for instance, the Maoris, were people who came to that country not that long ago, and they are considered quite definitely the indigenous people of that country. So what is a Bermudian? I've had discussions with multiple people about this. One, which I thought summed it up quite nicely, is if you could state that you have grandparents buried on this island, you are a Bermudian. That is one way to look at it. Whether one draws a line in the sand is up for debate. Some people would say, let's draw a line in the sand prior to the 1920s, when the first massive arrival of individuals came to this island. Another person might say, let's draw a line in the sand in 1955, again, before the next massive explosion of individuals. It's something that's got to be studied very carefully. I'm not sure that we need to get into that. If we can resolve these issues that we've raised during this panel discussion in other ways, do we have to get into what is a Bermudian? But basically, I think most people would probably agree that if my grandparents are buried on this island, I can probably say that I'm a Bermudian today.
Good, thank you.
I'm sure there'd be far more intellectual answers than that one.
Phil?
Phil?
My definition. If you eat codfish and potatoes.
Thanks, Phil.
If you support some cricket club. If you go to county games. If you like the gumbays.
Yeah.
Look, we have to, sometimes some of these kinds of questions divide as opposed to unite. We can probably come up with a range of conditions that would satisfy, major constituencies within our community. And that's really the work that we have to do. But the moment we, choose 3 or 4 conditions and then exclude, major segments of our community, we're not making progress. So, I would stay away from offering you, any technical definition based upon parentage and, complexion and height, weight, and any other criteria. I'd say let's do some work and figure out collectively what it is that we want this country to look like. And we'll get there. But it requires serious work by serious people. This is not an easy question to resolve. And I think we've been cavalier about it so far. Those who've chosen not to understand why thousands of people, surrounded the House of Parliament are living in a dream world. And, you have to put yourself in somebody else's shoes when you see behavior that you don't understand. I've had success in the majority world for 43 years. I learned how to navigate. You can do the same goddamn thing.
Thank you, Phil. Well, who doesn't like codfish and potatoes or whatever? So this immigration stuff is easy, right? Craig?
Well, going last. Well, obviously, the deep family ties. But what concerns me is what Bermudians have lost. And for the last 300 years, the one consistent part of the Bermudian identity was that stuff just out there. It's called salt water. And shipping. We are a water people. Bermudians are a water people, or at least we used to be. And most of us have in fact lost that. This thing called the motor car seems to have made us lose our way. The most recent thing are those devices that I see everyone staring into as I'm coming down on the ferry. Being Bermudian, perhaps a lot of it has to do with our past. If I could recommend some ferry reading to you, it's Michael Jarvis's book, In the Eye of All Trade. I think the man deserves some kind of national hero status because he's done us a great favor in helping us to understand who we are and to a large degree how we got to this point in time. It's not by accident, although there was a lot of luck involved. But one of the common themes in his book, In the Eye of All Trade, is that thing called the water. And I think we've really turned our backs on it. We're unpleasantly reminded about that when a hurricane comes through. We go back to our roots. Or when some other kind of natural disaster like September the 11th comes along and we begin to realize that we are an island, one of the most isolated places on the planet. And damn it, we need to sort of learn to behave like that.
Good. Thank you, Craig. This will be for a question for each of the panelists as well. I'll start off with Craig. So please state one item a new immigration policy has to have.
Immigration. One thing. Obviously, a limit on the number of people who's coming through. You want to be able to identify the most talented people, the folks that are going to make a major difference. I think in our history, we have brought in people who have made major differences, starting, I suppose, with the Portuguese coming during Governor Reed's tenure. Yeah, I suppose that's okay.
Good, thank you. Phil?
A two-part response: equity and a capacity for economic contribution.
Good, thank you. Lynn?
I think I go back to my comment on consultation and collaboration. I do personally believe that we need a limit on the number of people that are awarded status. That's a personal belief. But I think we can find a way forward if we're willing to sit down together and work out what's best, not only for Bermuda, but for Bermudians.
Good, thank you. Phil, would denying citizenship or permanent residency to people who have lived and worked in Bermuda not create a new educated underclass that would create future problems?
Can you repeat that?
I'm not,
Because
this is
a little early in the morning.
let me see if I can get this right. Would denying citizenship or permanent residency to people who have lived and worked in Bermuda not create a new, it says educated, maybe it's uneducated underclass that will create future problems? This underclass would have skills and talent, but not the permission to use them. Or we can go on to the next question. Yeah, let me go. This one, I know you'll have an answer for. Or, I mean, the other one is, yeah, I had a tough enough time reading that one. What damage do you think the civil disobedience campaign did to Bermuda's economy and its international business reputation?
Don't have an answer for that because, I've not heard a variety of opinion expressed by, people who are either running businesses. Look, disquiet always causes discomfort. But at the same time, we have to respect the reason why people were protesting in the first place. And there isn't a person on the planet who doesn't have a place of origin that began with protest. Right? Our history is replete with protest. For those of you who haven't had the privilege yet of seeing the play on Broadway that is taking America by storm, Hamilton, I know it's tough to get to go to see it, but if you can, please do, because you will learn a heck of a lot about protest and people who decide to be counted for a greater cause. So, I think we need to put it all in perspective. No lives were lost. There was no blood on the street, as far as I know. But some points were made, and it speaks to how it is we affect change. If we affect change in an open, transparent, collaborative, engaging way, we can avoid the likelihood of protest. But if we choose to be dictatorial and or non-inclusive, we're likely to have protest. The human condition is pretty clear. If you push me in the wrong direction, I am going to respond, no matter who I am. So I don't get excited about the fact that persons have chosen to show their point of view by gathering, because that is a part of the human experience. What I am more concerned about is the inability that we have to communicate effectively with one another and problem solve. We don't have enough example of that. That requires true leadership. There are very few people who understand and practice true leadership. And I think that's a huge deficit in this community. You have to be able to lead and communicate effectively, and that is not happening. And we need to do something about that. And we need to be able to have an adult conversation, a come to Jesus conversation. The conditions for a come to Jesus conversation are truth.
Thank you. Lynn, the history of Bermuda has been one of whites and blacks. Increasingly, the faces of Bermuda are neither black nor white. How should this impact Bermuda immigration policy?
I think the reality is that Bermuda's history and today in Bermuda, white and black is forefront. As much as we would like not to see it as being the forefront, it permeates every aspect of our society. None of us really want it to be that way. We all would like to sort of do the kumbaya thing and just say we're all just human beings. But the reality is it doesn't play out that way for everybody in our society. What was the final part of that question again, please? Thank you.
How should this impact Bermuda immigration policy?
I think Bermuda has been, when we look at the Bermudian population of Bermuda, we know that the population is divided pretty much down the line, about 25% white, I think it's about 10% mixed, some people identify as mixed, and the balance is black Bermudian. Something that was proposed at one of the presentations that CURB gave a few months ago was that perhaps immigration policy can look at the fact that it should reflect that demographic picture. Now, that's something that hasn't even arisen in our discussions in the Immigration Working Group, and we haven't even gone there. But I do know it was something that was brought up. I also know that Professor Brendan Leary, when he discussed power sharing at the BUEI a couple of weeks ago, and how countries who have experienced conflict are now moving towards a mode of power sharing, that when you are able to share that kind of thing, share power in a way that it hears everybody's voice, then you can move forward better. And he also talked about the fact that we need to look at the fact that statistics such as I've forgotten the terminology he used, but he said when we look at the demographics, we should reflect in our decisions those demographics, especially if they're based on either religion or race or a multitude of other things. So he was actually talking about himself, the fact that we need to look at those kind of demographics when we move forward in making decisions, because it's an important part of what a community is. So I'm just putting that out there. It's things that I've heard over the last few weeks that sort of make sense to me, and obviously have been used in places like Northern Ireland at the moment. So I think it's something we need to think about moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Craig, if Pathways to Status is not passed, how will Bermuda compete with other offshore jurisdictions who do have Pathways to Status or PRC?
When I first started to think about this problem, the economic problem, I had to ask myself, are our economic problems the result of what some people call secular stagnation, which means insufficient demand? You know, you're not buying enough coffee, T-shirts and stuff, or is it because there is a deficiency or there's something lacking in our growth potential, that we don't have enough? You know, the technology is outdated. We have old and outdated plant and equipment. Our people are ignorant and so on. Maybe it's a little bit of both. But as a jurisdiction, as an offshore financial center, if I believe the propaganda coming out of the BMA and out of the international business sector, is that Bermuda is in fact a leading jurisdiction. In fact, it has arguably the best regulatory environment, the best institutional framework for growing that particular sector. And immigration is sufficiently liberal enough to allow that sector to grow. Which begs the question, how much more do we need to give in order to make that sector a success? And that if making that sector a success economically, growing the economy at maybe 4 or 5% growth, leads to social dislocation, rising inequality, what's the point? One of the great problems facing the U.S. and European economies today is inequality, rising inequality. It's been identified as a major headwind. It's up there with the ending of the demographic dividend. So I'm saying all that to say that I'm less concerned about the problems of efficiency and growing our economy, and more about keeping it together. Because it's no good in Craig Simmons living in Tuckerstown and another place in Fairylands if the hood is burning down and people lose faith in the ability of our system to benefit them. Once that's gone, I think the game is over. You know, issues of efficiency and maximum economic growth, in fact, go out the window.
Good, thank you. Phil, can you speak to the exodus of educated black Bermudians? Why are these young black Bermudians who have skills not able to find a place in our economy?
Well, I actually support this notion of mobility. The world is flat, and I think it's important for young people to look abroad for the opportunity to develop skills and experience that eventually they can bring back to the island. So if I am in a position to offer advice to young people today, I'd say after you're done with your undergraduate or graduate degrees, stay where you are, find a job, gain experience, and then think about coming back. Because, you know, there's probably going to be limited opportunity. However, if you do have a set of skills that are applicable to this economy, then you should eventually look to return. And I would say don't wait as long as I did. I worked 36 years in the U.S. before I came back. And there are times when I regret not having come back sooner. But in my case, it was a question as to whether or not there would be opportunity here for me to apply my knowledge and skill successfully. So I'm an advocate of mobility. I'm an advocate of gaining the necessary work experience and skill such that when you do come back to take a job, you can be reasonably assured of long-term success.
Thank you. Lynn, most expatriates came from jurisdictions without the history of institutionalized racism that exists in Bermuda. Would not including them in the permanent population dilute the oligarchy and its effects?
I think I know what the person is saying. I would say expatriates coming from jurisdictions that don't have the history of Bermuda still have within their societies, and as much as they might want to think they don't, prejudice and racism. It's present no matter where you come from, even if you don't have. If you come from England, one sort of says, well, we never had that history. Unfortunately, the Industrial Revolution was based on slavery and the money that was made from slavery. And to try and disconnect how those wealthy people in the UK, the new rich following the Industrial Revolution, many of them earned their money directly from investments in slavery. So to try and disconnect yourself from that history is impossible. I could easily say as an expatriate in Bermuda, I've been here 42 years now, that I have no connection on this. What on earth am I getting involved in this sort of discussion? But I do know that I came here in the early 1970s and I got a job just like that. And I thought, innocently, it was because I was the best applicant. I was a secretary, right? I was a secretary and I thought, well, I must have been the best one. I know there were many excellent Bermudian secretaries who were out there, fully qualified, applying for that position, and I just jumped to the top of the list. So I'm afraid even expatriates in Bermuda today, you may not think you have that history, but you certainly have that benefit of whiteness unfortunately, which permeates every single one of us, as much as we would rather not think that we have the privilege of being white, even if we think we've worked hard all our lives. We have privileges that go along with that. Just like I had a privilege when I came to this island and was immediately given a job with absolutely I was on a work permit. I mean, I was literally jumped ahead of everybody else. So I think we have to understand that mentality still permeates our society. And those stereotypes, prejudice, and implicit bias, we get bombarded daily by the media, which creates these things inside of us that we all wish we didn't have, but it's there. And it took me a long time to figure that out, and therefore I can't judge anybody else. But I know that as I began to learn and understand these things, I've realized that I have, by default, had advantages in this country I never would have had in England if I'd stayed there. And I think we have to be honest about that. And as much as we want to say, I didn't have that history, I didn't bring that to Bermuda, maybe if we had more expatriates, it would all go away. Not going to happen. It's actually going to aggravate the situation.
Craig. Thank you, Lynn. Are you aware that Canada is considering a living wage so people can live a quality life?
Yes, I am.
Read it only yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Swiss have been debating it. Experiments have been conducted in the United States, even in Canada. It was in Winnipeg and in a township outside of Winnipeg called Dauphin.
Seattle.
They actually conducted controlled experiments using a guaranteed income. And the results are rather interesting, largely positive. It was found that people who were given these guaranteed wages didn't reduce their work effort significantly. The men reduced their work effort the least. The women reduced it considerably more, and it was noted that they shifted out of market work into household work. When these experiments were conducted in the 70s and 60s, those were the days when men were men and sheep were scared. Women stayed at home. Perhaps the biggest shift,
And you're still alive.
yeah, would have been in respect to teenagers, especially teenage boys. They spent an extra year or two in education, whereas in those particular environments in Winnipeg and Dauphin, they would have gone out into the workforce. So at least the controlled experiments that were done in Dauphin, in Seattle, New Jersey, speak positively of guaranteed incomes.
Good. Thank you, Craig. Okay. Phil, somebody would like some elaboration on what is equity. Can you please expand on that concept?
Happy to. I learned this from my youngest daughter, who is in a PhD program, getting with an emphasis on urban education. Equity requires that you address problems in a holistic way, that you consider all of the, needs and resource challenges that are faced by people who need remedy. And you can only do that if you engage in a level of work and an analysis that allows you to come to a very clear conclusion about what actions need to be taken to allow that person to realize their full potential. So equity, for me, is nothing more than doing the right things in the right way to ensure that everybody has the opportunity to realize their full potential.
Good. Thank you, Phil. Lynn, do you think institutionalized racism exists in the workforce today? And if so, how do we fix it?
That fixed it thing again. Yes, it does. As much as we think we're doing our best, it does permeate so many things. I use as an example how we used to, with our high schools, for instance, our alumni always got first dibs on the spaces. I believe a number of the high schools have moved away from that now. And when they were confronted with, how come your alumni are getting first dibs on places in the private schools, the response was, well, we've always done that. But the reason it was always done was to be exclusive. And so you have to start shifting your policies and procedures to make sure that somewhere embedded in them, there is not wording that actually manifests as being exclusive. So I think when we're looking at institutional racism, quite often it occurs in a situation where things have been done in such a way for so long that nobody's ever really looked really closely at the way the policies and procedures of, say, for instance, businesses are run, to see, well, is there anything in here that is actually being exclusive? It is the fact that we ask for 10 years experience, blah, 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 unrealistic for Bermudians? Should we not be saying to ourselves, well, maybe we need to give them some of that experience and ask for less experience, but in the case of a Bermudian, maybe we should be starting to say, well, we'll take them with a few years experience, but we'll train them, we'll send them off for the experience, we'll do the things necessary. It costs more, but as we've heard from all the members of the panel, it's a valuable investment in our future as a country. So I think institutionalized racism, yes, absolutely, every single company represented in this meeting needs to thoroughly look at their policies and procedures to see what it is about what they're doing that is exclusive. I know I have worries, a great deal of worries about companies that are now massively employing people part-time, which is excluding them from benefits. And companies that were previously maybe, for instance, having 10 employees working full-time jobs now have 30 employees. They're no longer paying the same kind of wages, they're no longer paying the same kind of benefits, they're no longer paying the same kind of payroll. So we have to look at those issues as a country and say, do we allow this to continue? Do we start mimicking organizations like Walmart and doing the kind of things that so many organizations in the States are doing? Or do we stick to what we've done historically, which is always given people full-time jobs? So there's a lot of things we need to think about when we're trying to save a buck, that if we're saving a buck, what are we doing to damage our community at the same time? And I'm very concerned about the underemployment, which is growing rapidly in the part-time, or sometimes it's called the consultation work, where people come in as consultants, but they're not paid any benefits, short-term. So we have to think of all those things moving forward. I hate to see that shift occurring in our country, which hadn't been there before, this underemployment.
Thank you, Lynn. So it's 5 to 10. We'll finish up with one last question. So Craig, you drew the short straw on this one. So why are only those that are white-collar workers considered skilled? Aren't blue-collar workers skilled and required in any society in order for it to function?
Well, I don't consider white-collar just because I've got a white-collar on today, but I'm on vacation. A clerk in a business, wouldn't consider them to be skilled. A skilled person, how do you differentiate skilled labor from unskilled labor? Labor that utilizes technology, or labor that has an in-depth understanding of how the production process works. I think that's the definition that economists normally use to differentiate between what we call effective labor, or labor that benefits from technology, and labor that doesn't. If I'm someone who's simply filling a cement mixer with sand and cement, I think that's pretty much unskilled labor. But the person who is putting the mortar on the wall, if they're plastering a wall, that's a skill. And in fact, in the construction trades, there has been a significant technological advancement. When the airport finally gets going, a lot of the techniques that are going to be used down there are not going to be 20th century techniques. The materials will be 21st century materials, and they will require 21st century skills. So I disagree that white collar is code for skilled labor.
Good.
We've got to get that idea away, which is probably one reason why there's a serious deficiency of tradespeople in Bermuda. If you ever called a plumber, you're going to have a hard time finding a Bermudian. The last great group of tradespeople in Bermuda would have graduated from the Bermuda Technical Institute way back in the 70s. Those are all what I would call skilled individuals.
Good, thank you. Just while I think of it, there is, as you all know, a consultative immigration reform working group that has been set up that does have a website, and hopefully this morning's session has been useful for all of you. But if there are sort of issues that have been raised this morning that you think would be worthy from your perspective of this working group hearing about, they do have a phone number, 500-4664, or you can send them an email at immigrationbda@gmail.com. So I just want to give a plug for that group that's spending a lot of time addressing the issues that they've been asked to address. So with that, that sort of concludes the morning session. So first of all, I'd like to thank so much the three panelists who put so much time and effort into this morning. And I think, as Phil said, we have to have healthy debates on issues that are relevant and important to Bermuda. So, whether it's immigration or the airport or living wage or whatever, the Chamber's view going forward is that we want to create these types of forums so that people can get together in a trusted environment, speak up on what's relevant for all of us here today and for our kids and grandkids. So on behalf of the Chamber, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this morning, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next Chamber event. So, and thank you very much to Kendra Burgess and the group from the Chamber of Commerce for arranging all this for the benefit of all of us this morning. So thank you, Kendra and Stephanie and Haley. So with that, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.